Hi, I'm Jen, and this is the Service Design Show, episode 231.
We all want to make a lasting impact, to see things change for the better in the complex systems we work in. But so often it feels like these systems are designed to stay exactly as they are, to maintain that status quo. So, how do you find those little pockets, those tiny wedges in the door to actually help things and people adapt and learn? Let's find out. Hi, if you're new here, welcome to the Service Design Show, where we invite the brightest minds in our field and explore what's truly needed to design great services that resonate with people, push businesses forward, and honor our planet. Our guest today is a deep thinker with a wonderfully playful and honest edge. She started her journey in physics, which gave her a unique lens on systems and patterns. But a pivotal moment led her away from a traditional academic track and into teaching and eventually into the heart of service and experience design. Throughout it all, she's been fascinated and driven by how learning actually happens. Not just formal instruction, but that deeper process of adaptation and sense making. And for a fun fact, our guest Jen Briselli plays ice hockey, and as a defenseman, her aim is to disrupt the other team's play. A little hint perhaps of the approach she brings to our work. She's got some really thought-provoking ideas for us today about how we can all get a bit better at navigating the complex worlds we operate in. So in today's conversation, you're going to learn about the real reasons behind risk aversion and how to connect with those who fear change. How to shift your team from needing all the answers to confidently navigating through genuinely uncertainty. Concrete strategies for getting better at sensing and responding when the future is unpredictable. How you can start nurturing learning even when systems seem to be built to resist any change. And simple yet powerful tactics like loosening the soil to help your projects and teams truly flourish. You know, it's easy to think some people are just natural risk takers and others aren't. But what Jen really brought home for me is that our capacity for learning and embracing uncertainty can dramatically shift. We explore this idea, and it even leads us to a rather memorable discussion about my chances of survival on a deserted island, possibly inhabited by bears. Yeah, you heard it right. It's a fun moment, but it highlights a serious point about how our environment shapes our ability to adapt. So whether you're leading a team through change or navigating your own career pivots, this conversation offers some great insights on fostering adaptability. So there's clearly a lot to unpack here. Join me for what I found to be a really insightful conversation with Jen Briselli, and I'll be back at the very end to share some of my own closing reflections on it all. I am your host, Mark Fontijn, and you are listening to the Service Design Show. Welcome to the show, Jen.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
We are going on an adventure together with the listeners. And it's, I don't know, it's not scary, but it's, when I was preparing this conversation, I was like, am I over my head into a topic that I really don't know anything about, but we'll see. We are going to figure out how we can not only survive and maybe even thrive inside complex systems. Most of us who are listening work inside some complex system, organization, service, NGO. Like, the world is complex. It's getting even more complex, and it's super hard to actually figure out if you're making change, if you are moving in the right direction. So many moving parts. And it sounded to me like you might have some clues about how we can navigate that. So I'm really happy that you're here on this adventure with us. And the first thing that you said to me when we were preparing is that we, as a service design community, should consider evolving and moving on from just quote unquote designing service towards designing systems that learn, or learning systems? Help me out here. Is that correct?
Yeah, close, but I would be careful about designing systems because I definitely hear so many folks these days who are like, I want to design systems. But the spoiler is you can't design a system. You can nudge it or wiggle it, or you can design the affordances in it, or indirectly you can impact the way a system might behave. I'm just getting into the semantics there, so we don't have to get too into that. But yeah, I think the headline is being able to design the conditions for more positive or desirable things to emerge, which I think is what designers do for a living. Doing that inside complex systems means the better and more quickly that you and the team and the organization and the system can learn, the more effective you can be. And I'm not the only, this is certainly not, my novel thought. I'm starting to, I think hear a chorus of folks in service design in particular who I think are really attuned to thinking in terms of ecosystems, service ecosystems, far less about the stuff of the ecosystem and the social relations, the stuff in between. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, to me, this relates to the topic that we've tried to address more often. That even with a service, it's really hard to actually, it's maybe even impossible to design a service. You create the conditions in which hopefully a certain type of behavior emerges and certain user experience emerges. That is, you can design the conditions, you can try to design the organization, but you sort of specifically zoom in on the learning aspect, if I'm not mistaken. Why is that?
Yeah. And not to the exclusion of everything else that goes into that. But I think in particular, um, of all the places and with all the people that I've worked with over the years, it's just become so clear, especially in the last several, that individuals and groups of people who can learn together quickly and effectively are the ones who can more easily understand where to nudge or where to do this or where to do that, to see, to read weak signals among the noise. And there's a level of this that I think requires a differentiation between the word learning, like I got to learn a new skill, I got to learn a new tool, Figma's in, Figma's out, or I got to figure out which method to apply here. That's in the mix, but that's when I say learning, I think something a little bit deeper. I think more about encountering or engaging with others, human or non-human aspects of a system or an environment and adjusting in some way, if you like think of any example, any service, any ecosystem that you've ever designed for or within, the ability for that system to deliver something good, which, that's a loaded word, but the ability to do something that you look at and say, this is good, this is effective, this is helping people in a meaningful way. Usually there's something built into that system that allows the individuals within it and the system to adapt in response to context. And that is what I mean when I say learn. So how do you design for that? I don't know, but I feel like as a field, we we can probably start to think and talk a little bit more about it explicitly. So that's what I'm here to poke and prod and provoke people to do.
Before we start to explore how we might do that, I'm curious to your reasons. Why now? Like, why do you feel this is the moment that we need to be even more aware of this?
I don't think there's anything special about now. I think maybe it's just that I'm starting to notice other people are more receptive to it. I think, as you even mentioned at one point earlier, like the world is, we like what VUCA is VUCA in anymore or is VUCA out, right? I feel like,
It depends on which age you are.
but you hear it a lot. Every TED talk or every like piece online starts with like the world's growing more ambiguous, complex, whatever. And side note, and I always say this, I'm not convinced it is. These things we think about as complex experiences and parts of life that we experience in that way have always been complex and uncertain and volatile. I think that just by virtue of being a far more connected globe, that we're a lot more aware of it, and the information flows more freely, which means we have no choice but to act with some level of knowledge of it, which just compounds again, the complexity, uncertainty, et cetera, et cetera. But I think because people are becoming more aware, I think that does make it a good time to think about the nature of adaptation and learning. And, in a kind of counterintuitive way, the solution isn't that we design for learning. This is again where it gets confused a little bit with instructional design or even designing the conditions or experiences of people who are learning. This is a little bit, I think bigger or beyond or outside of that. But the short answer is I don't think there's anything special about right
Hmm,
now. And I don't think there's anything special happening that is requiring this. I think it's more that there's a receptivity that is happening as people are growing aware. So it's rather than a trigger or a call, I think there's an openness to it. And so to take advantage of that opening and to have that conversation and to bring the thinking about the nature of learning into a little bit more of our practice as a field is good. It's good timing. I think it's serendipitous rather than the time is now.
I like that. The time serendipity is hitting upon us. What might also be serendipitous is that the path you took, like if you had to project your trajectory into where you are today, it would probably, like, chances that you would end up here are very slim. But if you connect the dots in hindsight, it might make sense. So maybe it would be very helpful for us to sort of understand where you're coming from and what led you to this interest in complex systems.
Yeah, and I will say everything you just said, though, is kind of true about everybody. Look at anybody and where you're at right now, and you could say, gosh, what are the odds I ended up exactly here in this moment doing this exact thing? And it would not be that likely, but you can always connect the dots post hoc. You can always rationalize or draw a story or craft the narrative thread, through your story, after the fact. So I think it's good to remember that it is much easier to think about that after the fact and connect the meaning. But to that end, sure, yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I studied physics as an undergrad. I was one of those kids who, like all of us, I think, in design would have said things like, I love learning, I was curious, all the words on the resumes, problem solving, lifelong learning, da, 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 da. So, but I did really love learning about all kinds of things. And to me, as a 17-year-old, physics represented like the most fundamental. It was like I kind of figured I'd pick that and then I could branch out from there. It seemed like the thing that if I was going to study anything, I could do better to have that sort of, formal instruction versus everything else I could kind of learn on my own if I needed. I loved it, and then after a couple years in undergrad, realized I did not want to go to grad school for physics, even though I would have like really enjoyed that. I knew that that was going to mean kind of climbing higher and higher inside like an academic silo, and I didn't want that because I really liked exposure to a lot of cross-disciplinary things, and had been doing some peer tutoring and realized at some point, gosh, I really like this challenge of getting inside people's minds and like kind of understanding, trying different ways of like speaking to whatever their mental schema was to help them understand. Gosh, oh my God, that's teaching, isn't it? Ugh, I should be a teacher. So it was like with almost like a level of self-disgust that I, the physics major, like said, I'm going to take my physics degree and become a high school teacher. And, I don't know how this would land in other cultures and other countries around the world, but here in the States, I got a lot of pushback. A lot of people were like, that's insane. You'll be overeducated to be a high school teacher, which, as an aside, is a problem. Even that statement. Think about that, everyone. But I did that and I enjoyed it. And I loved teaching for I was in that field for about 10 years. I really enjoyed the first several years, figuring it out, really kind of having no clue how to do it because nobody ever does. And very much that challenge of understanding how to offer students different tools that they could use to make meaning. And there are all kinds of bureaucracies and other things tied up with it that eventually kind of made it a little bit too much friction for me. But I started to feel like what I was doing was the same thing every year, which you do as a teacher. And I think for some people, they love that. But I just serendipitously, again, there's the word, I just happened to come across either some writing or a magazine or something that had to do with information design. I had no idea the field of information design or experience design existed at all. And it sort of just put the bug in my ear. So I started doing a lot more reading and paying attention to that field. And I'll skip all the details, but ultimately ended up leaving teaching to go back to school, studied basically experience design, service design, systems thinking, did the MDes at Carnegie Mellon. So that's the Kool-Aid I drank. And I found surprisingly that a lot of what I had been doing as a teacher was highly relevant. I totally expected it was going to be this like 90-degree pivot. And I got into the courses and the work we were doing, and we were reading things that I had read, as an educator, and I was like, a reflective practitioner, and I was like, what? It's all the same, big epiphany. So fast forwarding from there, moved through the world of design and had been in various roles. But the reason I zoomed in on that piece of it, you're like, my God, Jen, this is too much detail. Shut up. Is because looking back, I can very easily now see that a lot of the interest in learning, you could say, oh, it's because you were a teacher. And so learning has been this thread through everything you've done. People often ask, do you miss being a teacher? My stock answer for that for a long time was, I miss teaching, but not being a teacher. But I don't miss teaching because I get to do teaching in a lot of the work I do. I also am a teacher again. I teach at the post-secondary level, little bits here and there. I'm an adjunct professor in a couple places, and like it's not quite that. And it isn't really, again, learning that I'm interested in that formal teaching way. I think there's a really important difference between teaching and facilitating learning. And it's the latter that I'm really interested in. So the thread for me and that kind of after the fact dot connecting, it does make sense if you, go back as far as being an educator in a formal classroom teacher role. But as I've moved through different agency positions, I've spent most of my design career in agencies, did a little couple stints in a couple in-house places. But ultimately, when I look back at them, what they all have in common, and every project I've ever done that I have felt was a success, it had some other objective, it had some other goal. It involved solving user needs, solving business outcomes, whatever they might have been. The secret thing that powered the success was that learning was supported in some way. Either learning explicitly supported on the part of the team or the organization, or learning was supported on the part of the user or the customer. And again, not explicitly, just enabling things to change and adapt.
Mm.
So there's the red thread that you can
Yes.
force on top of that narrative.
I liked how you mentioned the difference between teaching and facilitated learning, right? I
Mm-hmm.
remembered that correctly, hopefully. And the interconnection with systems and services and organizations, like I'm trying to see how those two relate. And the opposite of learning is something that is static, that's
Mm-hmm.
not evolving,
Mm-hmm.
that's a status quo. Um, that sounds very much like the situation most of us are in. We are organizations, almost by design, are designed to maintain the status quo instead of adopting. Right? Is it? Do you see the same?
Yeah. And how's it going, guys? How's that going for
Well,
everybody?
depends on who you ask.
That's right. Are we asking the designers who are stuck in those environments, or are we asking the shareholders? So yes, very exactly. I mean, that's exactly, I think, the point. I find, and I know that probably at least a few, if not more, of your past guests have made a similar point that as a field, because right now we're talking at kind of high level abstractions, and this could apply to any kind of creative practice, not design alone, or even service design in particular. But I think as a field, service design attracts a certain type of practitioner who is attuned to ecosystem thinking, right? That's why we talk about things like ecology or service ecosystems so much in this work. And because of that, it's folks that I think are also attuned to the fact that when you think about an ecosystem, it means zooming out from the one individual touch point or the one product or the one interface, zooming out not just in space to understand all the myriad factors and influences and affordances that interconnect and are interdependent on each other, but also in time. I don't think we do it quite as well, but like zooming out in time is important too. And it doesn't mean zooming out in time so we can predict the future or so that we can control the future or that we can treat the past like it's destiny. But I just think as a field, we've kind of got at least a lot of folks in this world, like we've got the stuff. We've got the right stuff, okay? So we don't need to wait for clients or our managers to assign us projects that allow us to be more learning oriented, we can just do it. And, as an aside, I can always hear the chorus of voices of people who might hear me share thoughts in any place or form and go, oh, this is all well and good, Jen, but like, I got to go to my job tomorrow and I got to still work on that service blueprint or, conduct those interviews and deliver that report to the stakeholders who need to like feel good about it so they can put it in the quarterly earnings. And, reporting earnings to shareholders, I get it. We're stuck in a certain economic model here, at least in the States and mostly the globe. And until that changes radically, which we can also be party to, helping that along, we're also still perfectly capable of creating and kind of digging out spaces in the places we do work that allow for that learning and adaptation to happen in small little places. So you very rightly were like, what about, thinking about the nature of stasis and things that are stuck? If learning is adaptation and the opposite of that is things staying still and not changing. Yeah, bingo. But that really only applies if you zoom out far enough that you might see this organization is inert. But like, life knows how to learn naturally. Humans know how to learn naturally. There's some quote, and I can never remember the author, but it's like the only like instinctive thing we know how to do is, to like, there's something like the only intuitive interface is the nipple, like as in breastfeeding. Everything else is learned. Everything else is learned. Think about that. So we know how to do it in turn, like it's part of who we are in our DNA. So what I'm trying to arrive at is things are only stuck if you are looking at them from a far enough view.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what you do, you can find a way to zoom in or find a lower level of resolution or granularity or however you want to use the metaphor. Somewhere on a very local level, you can see things are actually more malleable. And it might literally be contained just within you. It might be your team that's a little bit more shifty, might be your larger, line of business. It might literally be you in your role. But if that's all that starts, that's still sometimes enough, because being able to then ask, what could I wiggle or do a little bit differently in this process, in this practice? How could I change the way that we either operate in a way that allows for a change to happen without too much holding it back? Or if I'm thinking about how I'm designing the services that I'm designing, are there ways to sneak low stakes things into that process that leave a little bit more room, a little bit more openness, something a little undefined that leaves a little space for change and adaptation and learning? I mean, again, speaking in abstractions, we can get more specific, but
Yeah, we'll get more specific, and I like how you mentioned that when you zoom out far enough, everything sort of moves very slowly. If we zoom out and look at the planet on a scale of a million years, like nah, not that much has changed. But like you
yeah.
said, I don't know, in your direct vicinity, things are moving at a different pace. So you need to be mindful of the scale and the scope and the pace at which things are moving.
Yeah.
Um, I'm let's explore a little bit. What is the attitude, mindset, characteristics? Like, what does qualify as a learning, more adaptable system? Let, we could project it on an individual, but let's keep thinking in systems here.
Yeah, whether we're going to talk about a person or a team or a system, I think it's important to know that it's not like an entirely essentialist kind of quality of the thing. Like, it's easy with this kind of thinking to say, well, that person or that organization or that community just is more or less willing to learn or open to learning. And it sort of becomes, that risks it becoming this like immutable trait or quality of the person or the system. And even if you don't mean to, it gets you stuck into this way of thinking that that it can't change. We're getting kind of meta. Oh, I'm just not a good learner. We talk about people like we're trying to hire. We want lifelong learners. We want, like you want to have initiative and such. Like that's a problem because that in and of itself is really not accurate. We know from so much of our work, the study of humans, of brain science, of decision science, of complex adaptive system science, at all those scales, it's all about context. So you can take an individual and you can take a company and you can put them in different contexts, and their ability to, or their capacity to learn. A phrase I like for this is like adaptive capacity. People will go, oh, adaptive capacity. Well, that's great. That sounds like something I could find a way to measure, and we could have an adaptive capacity score. And, it's like, but the point is that it changes with context. So that there is not like an innate quality of you or a system. So to answer your question, you're
Yeah,
like, okay, Jen, got
well,
it.
Jen, so to
Yeah.
check if I'm getting this right, so if you put me on a deserted island, most likely my learning capacity, adaptive capacity will at least double
I hope.
compared to me sitting comfortably at my
Yeah.
couch, right?
Well, and that's a good example because in that case, part of what we've done is made it like existential. It's
Mm.
like learn or die. um, but there's also other ways that aren't just learn or die, although for some organizations that's the reality. But there's also the positive side of that. There's the positive side of a context that rewards learning and adaptation, a context that allows it. So now that I've finished giving like my entire huge caveat warning about the answer I'm about to give, there aren't innate qualities. I think one of the things that is helpful to think about is whether there is slack or space or openness in an environment or in a system that allows for it to happen. When things are tied too tightly or rigidly, when a system is engineered perfectly, think about where you actually don't want change and adaptation, like an engineered structure, a bridge, a building,
Surgery room.
a surgery room, right? And even all of these actually, like, there are people listening who are like, guys, yes, there's actually, yeah, a bridge is built with expansion joints that can move. So even when we try to come up with examples, there's exceptions that end up, making all of this a little bit, I think, rich and lovely. But the point is, it's the opposite of that, right? What makes something rigid is what makes it tougher for it to learn and adapt, to be resilient. And so the answer I am willing to give with the least amount of discomfort is that the quality or qualities, less about a mindset, less about a trait, and more is a combination of the context something finds itself in, and the amount of slack or give or wiggle room something has. And I would just sort of encourage anybody listening to this, think about you as an individual and the times and places in your life where you actually felt like you had adaptive capacity, like you were really able to be creatively adaptive. Where was that happening in your life? And like, what was going on around you? What was the context? What was being rewarded or encouraged versus punished or discouraged? And how much like open space, literally or figuratively, did you feel like you had? I encourage some like reflection on that, because that can unlock a lot of interesting things about how you might arrange a team, how you might organize a company, how you might change a practice that allows or encourages that kind of healthy adaptation and resilience.
So, yes, please do reflect and share back in the comments what
Yeah.
comes out. It would be super interesting to hear a few examples from you of contexts that you've seen that have shown a highly adaptable qualities. I wanted to say also the ones that haven't, but I think the examples there are plenty. So, what have you seen? Like, what are some interesting examples?
I'll give a couple, but I also will say this is always another tricky place because, folks want an example, usually just to kind of make this feel a little bit more concrete. Like, okay, Jen, Slack, openness, like, what the hell are you talking about? So, we can talk about that in a second. But the other thing that happens the minute you give examples, people want to emulate. They go, okay,
Copy and
like the
paste. Yeah,
Spotify model,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
everybody's going to do that, right? So
yeah.
even if we know we shouldn't, we still do it even without kind of being aware of it. And that's honestly, in my mind, one of the biggest dangers. It's one of the reasons that I know very frustratingly, I will often not give examples for things because of that danger, which ends up causing more harm than good, even in the attempt, right? So to that end, I would caution people, remember that context is really critical, especially when we're talking about, again, complex adaptive scenarios, most of the work most of us are doing are in these kind of worlds, unless you're designing for scenarios that are very tightly engineered, very on the rails. And there are always pieces of the work we do that are like that. There's nothing wrong with linear thinking in small snippets where things are actually very much on the rails and controlled. Like, that's all good. But so to that end, I would say the other thing is the examples that always come to mind for me are never very satisfying for people because they're never like, oh, this business did this very interesting thing and then learned and changed. I mean, there are examples of like businesses pivoting their business model and stuff, which are great. It's always on a more local level. It's always in a small room. So, for example, working with large healthcare organizations, and I do a lot of work in healthcare in the States, although a lot of work outside of that too. And usually when I've seen this happen, it's because somebody somewhere inside the organization can kind of see that everybody on the team or in the organization really wants to try to do something a little differently, but they're constrained by either like past practice or just the way things have to happen. Or in healthcare in particular, obviously there's a lot. I mean, it's a highly regulated environment, so there's a lot that you can't really change. But I've worked with some teams, and I'm thinking of one in particular, who realized that we kind of just need to like open up some space to allow some of the like informal networks and knowledge that exist to like actually connect with each other. And so this, again, very unsatisfying answer, but for a lot of the time when I think about how this can be effective, it's never we did a thing. It's sometimes we stopped doing a thing that was in the way, like requiring these checks or points or whatever, and we just freed people up to make decisions. But more importantly, it was we actually just opened up some space. We took a few meetings off of the calendar. We removed these stage gates in the process. We actually removed this requirement or this level of approval. We started having meetings, but more like collaborative sessions. I'm not a fan of the word workshop, but workshops, and there's particular examples where I remember helping a particular team, kind of through a program of let's just get in a room. Let's actually share what we know about this particular topic that we're trying to solve, performance on certain metrics or what have you, and actually just like open up the space for let's learn. And I don't literally mean like share PowerPoint slides and stuff, but like let's just actually talk, and doing that in a way that's informal. Now, again, I can hear the chorus of people saying, yeah, well, that's all well and good, Jen, but like I don't have the power to do that. Like I have goals and metrics I'm accountable for, and I can't just suddenly have, one less thing to put in my day and one more free hour. My boss isn't going to give me 20% free time for adaptive capacity. And to that, I am sympathetic. But most of the times that I have seen this happen in an effective way, folks don't ask for or wait for permission to do that. They cram it in. That feels like it's more at first, but it's almost like putting a wedge in a door so the door never shuts all the way. Can you be a wedge in a friendly, good way? Or can your team or something you're doing serve as a wedge to hold something open a little longer than usually people are comfortable with? And in that way, if you can hold that process open a little longer, it means that eventually that thing can kind of expand. I often give the example of it's a pretty well-known phenomenon that like when people go to the doctor, they have their doctor visit, they have their conversation, and then only as the doctor is turning to leave, they call it like the doorknob moment, that like when the doctor touches the doorknob, and that's when the person says, oh, doc, I actually have one more question. And it's like the big one. It's the thing that they really should have started the conversation with. Those doorknob moments in the doctor's office are the kind of things you want to try to create in your environment for you or your team or the people you work with. And that's kind of how we talk about like put a wedge in the door, hold something open, create slack in the system. And even if you're not a manager or a leader who doesn't have the power to change other people's schedules, you can be that little wedge in a friendly way. Get yourself invited to things you're not usually invited for, even if you're just a fly on the wall, because then you start linking up and opening up that space for stuff. So yeah, that's not a great example because it's not very concrete, but to be specific, some of the things that I've seen happen in type of organizations that I tend to work with, they're not we changed how we created, a product. But even for a team that uses service blueprinting and journey management and tools that very tightly measure the flow of something, how can you build a little bit of like question mark space into those tools? What does it look like in your work and how your team uses those tools? We're always driving for something to be pretty tightly kind of coupled or understood. Like if this happens, then this happens. Everything's accounted for, all the contingency. Either this happens over a chronological period or it's event triggered or whatever it is. Is there a way to account for a little bit of like a, wait a minute, this is going to be a little gray area and like we want to keep it that way. We want to allow for something to be not so tightly coupled. What would that mean? So that's another little example I would give.
Thank you for sharing these examples. I do think that they are practical, and the doorknob moment and the wedge is something that will not go out of my head for the next 7 days at least. So one thing I'm curious about is, okay, if we say examples are challenging because people might go and copy paste them, can we identify the quote unquote outcomes when you're doing this, again, quote unquote, right? So if you don't know yet how, at least what kind of behavior can you observe that signals, I think we're moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's pretty important about that, about the answer to this, is that for a lot of situations, the outcomes are not, they're not necessarily things you can plan for explicitly, but you can, it's like a we know it when we see it kind of thing. It's a little bit indirect, it's more oblique. And so what I would encourage folks to ask themselves is, how would we know if we feel like we can be adaptive, right? And that'll look and feel different everywhere, even for an individual, let alone a team or a company. But that's a really good exercise as a group to say, what are some things that we would expect to see or feel if we felt like this was a place that was safe to learn and adapt? And that can look like things like people feel really safe and comfortable to call up or to point out, like, here's another way to think about this, and not have that be swatted down. Like, no, 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 we know that. There's a million ways to do it, but we've been doing it this way and there's a reason and it's effective. And like, that's going to be a distraction and that's going to take us totally off course. And if that stuff gets swatted down right there, that is a good example of the lack of adaptive capacity. Now, making it safe for someone to bring up another way or a thing they want to try or this or that. I mean, there's actually, AI is a great example for this right now because it's kind of the reverse. It's like, everybody, hurry up, figure out how to use AI. And we're going to encourage everybody on every team and every organization to play with AI, and that it's mandated, you know? Think about the difference between someone just organically kind of being like, gosh, I've been living and breathing this particular service, and I've kind of been wondering, like, could we try this instead? Or would it be possible for the org to deliver this support in a different way? Or could we introduce a different touch point where this could preempt that? The point is, though, it's got to be something that can arise organically from the human doing the abductive reasoning and the sense making, with their peers, with the others, that start to go, oh, aha, like these things might connect in a new way, not mandated play with and learn and try new things, because I said so, because the shareholder said so. But I think that in terms of outcomes, it starts to look like, do people feel safe to bring those things up and it's not going to just get swatted down? And another way to think about it is when when something goes wrong, whether it's, we have poor earnings, we have a poor outcome, we test something and it doesn't go the way we think it will, and we're back to the drawing board because the user, engaged with this thing in a way we just didn't expect. I'm trying to use lots of different examples because I know folks are all over the place in the audience as far as their roles, but thinking about how to look at those moments as something. Jack Mesereau is a guy who wrote about transformative learning. There I have mixed feelings, and a lot of people do, because transformative learning theory and a lot of the stuff that is in that world, it's descriptive, it's not prescriptive. It touches on the aspects of things that I've already spoken about why I don't like. But suffice to say, I like one of his terms, which is disorienting dilemma. And one of the things he argues is that true learning happens when there's a disorienting dilemma that happens, and that we end up kind of reframing our understanding of the world in response to it. And it has a lot of parallels in other places too. Learning theorists and others talk about the mental schema and whether we accommodate or modify things, whether we change our mindset in response or whether we just fit it in there and keep going as we always have. Paulo Freire talked about like problem posing education. Everyone's talking about this stuff in just different phrases. So in your company or in your role, if you find yourself faced with a disorienting dilemma, looking at that as a trigger for adaptation. So that's another one where I would say, okay, an outcome is that when you are faced with a disorienting dilemma, is that met with curiosity and maybe even a little bit of excitement, because that is where something novel might come, where an adaptation might emerge, versus is it let's quickly resolve this and get back to where we were. So again, this will be unsatisfactory to many viewers, but I think that understanding the outcomes you see, or how you know if we're doing it right, and do we have good adaptive capacity, and have we figured out as a team to support learning, it's never a do this or make sure this is occurring, but it's a we can kind of feel it and we know it when it's happening, and you experiment your way into it. You wiggle your way into it. How do you make it so that when you encounter a disorienting dilemma, people are excited instead of let's hurry up and finish and resolve this? I don't know, because I
You
don't know your team.
you
Is your
fire middle
team?
management.
Yeah, well, there's that too. There's also something to be said for remember to apply what we know. I'll be generous and assume we, collective we as service designers, we know a lot about human behavior. We're designing for humans. I hope most of us have an appreciation for the fact that what someone does is not a function of just them as an isolated individual, but is a function of the way that all the things in the system around them are incentivizing or disincentivizing what they do, their history, what they've learned, the people that they've engaged with their whole lives, right? And that's true for middle management. That's true even for the CEO who makes way more money than anyone human should make. That's true for everything. So if you can remember that, and remember that there are components of the context or the environment that you can move. I can't change the fact that like that CEO out there somewhere that I might point to makes way more money than he should. And his personal motivations aren't in the places that I think they should be. But the reality is that there are still aspects of the environment that I might still be able to have an influence on. And if I can look at what's within my influence, there are some that if I change those things, they could have ripple effects that do ultimately end up changing those things that feel out of reach. So to that end, we can joke about like who's stopping us from engaging with and embracing a disorienting dilemma, because that's usually a portal or a doorway to incredible learning. If our boss tells us no, get back to work, there might be something that you could look into. That what is your boss responding to in their environment? Is it an existential threat to them if they were to let you approach a disorienting dilemma and want to explore it a little bit? Like they'll lose their job, they'll lose their salary, maybe. So are there ways that you might engage with that person if they truly have a leash or some kind of control over what you can do in your day-to-day? Can you actually start to engage with them in a way that helps them recognize that it might not need to be that much of an existential threat, and that they're allowing you to explore a little bit more or to hold a little bit more slack in the system may not need to mean as much fear as it might arouse for them?
Mm.
Anyway, this is getting super, super meta, but I know that there are lots of conversations out there in the world about translating the value of design and learning to speak with business speak. And I think a lot of that is good intentioned. I think it's pointing in the same direction, but I think sometimes it misses the mark, because the point isn't to convince these folks in that language that this stuff needs to happen for this reason. And I think it's more about speak the level of human motivation and understand like what terrifies somebody who has some control over you, what terrifies them, and help take away some of that terror. And then you can learn. You can't learn when you're terrified. You guys know that. If you're on that island, that desert island, and your adaptive capacity is like it's learn or die, but then there's a bear chasing you, like you're not learning how to
What island are you on there that has bears?
Well, that's a good question. There could be bears on an island.
Interesting. Well, we'll need to fact check that.
I'm
if
gonna
there are
Google it as
bears on
soon as we're
islands.
done.
So, Jen, okay, cool. We're talking about creating the conditions staging the conditions. We're talking about what can you do on a personal level. There are different levels at which you can approach this. Um, One thing that you also mentioned in your notes to me, which you haven't yet addressed, but I do want to sort of go into this topic, is you said we need to shift from building confidence in answers towards confidence in navigation.
Hmm.
And I would love if you could share a story on how are you building confidence in navigation?
I
And what do you
think
mean with that? Maybe that's
yeah, it's funny when I went, I
set
was
the
like, oh,
stage.
did I say that?
Yes, you did.
Sounds like something I would say. This kind of ties back to something I've been actually chatting with a bunch of people about lately, just like in casual, friendly conversation, which is this concept of like uncertainty tolerance, which we tend to treat it like it's again, like an immutable trait. Like that person just is really uncomfortable with uncertainty, versus this person over there. Again, it's not like that. There are definitely contexts where you are going to be a lot more comfortable with uncertainty, like games, okay? Like play, versus when your salary or your livelihood or your life is on the line, right? So it's always, again, I'm broken record, context dependent. But I'm finding it interesting lately that there's like a renewed interest. I remember a couple years ago there was a little bit of a buzz around like uncertainty tolerance and like, is this a psychological kind of trait? Can we increase it? It would do us all well to be more uncomfortable with uncertainty because then we don't shut down and fear and we don't drive to try to get certainty where we can't have it and we narrow our perspectives and we miss things, all that. It's like, oh, if we could just be at ease with not knowing. And I just think to myself, like, that's not humans are never going to just be that way.
Mm.
We're evolutionarily wired to be a little bit wary of uncertainty so we can survive. But it feels like it's kind of coming back again. And I bring that up in relation to what you've just asked because in these conversations, I do find folks think a lot about I'm all for everything you're saying, Jen. I think openness and learning how to navigate uncertainty and, taking stepwise experimental, safe to fail kind of iterative experimenting, learning my way forward. But, my team isn't like that. They're terrified of uncertainty and they just want to know what we're going to do and follow a recipe. I'm an experimental artist and my friend is a baker who wants to follow all the directions, so like it turns into this conversation about a human trait. And I don't think that it's not that simple, but I don't think that it's wrong. I think there's a reason people go to that and they always want to change someone else's. No one ever wants to think about themselves. They always want to change that person. How do I increase that person's uncertainty tolerance? And unfortunately, and I've done some digging into this, there's not really a lot of great um like writing or science about this, partly because it's so slippery. It's context dependent. There are some out there, and I can dig up a few if you want for show notes later, some good writing on it. But basically, what I personally think, totally untested, not evidence-based, haven't done any research. This is just Jen reflecting on like whatever, 43 years of existence. I think uncertainty tolerance, and this is adjacent to what you asked about, the ability to navigate something without having confidence in all your answers being right, is a function of how you can learn. So if I am entering a scenario as an individual or as a business, I'm encountering a volatile market, pandemic, whatever's happening right now, poly crisis, you realize even if we have a level of confidence in our answers right now or what's happening right now, we know that that could change so rapidly that our confidence in 6 months is, zero. And so getting away from trying to hold too tightly to knowing the answers at all times and instead getting better at shifting and learning so that if things change, again, when I say navigating in that note that I had shared about, let's not cling so tightly to our confidence in our answers as much as confidence in our ability to change and learn as our answers need to change. A lot of that comes from, do you feel like you have the ability to actually read signals that are happening in the world? And do you have the ability to respond? And I think the phrase people love these days is sense and respond, right? You hear this a lot. We can't predict and control. You can't control the future, only how fast you learn. Like that's one. Get away from command and predict and control and more towards sense and respond. Isn't that lovely? Yeah, well, how the hell do you sense and respond? Break it down. Sense. How do you get better at sensing? Individually and as a team, as a community, sense making and being good at and getting better at always sort of knowing how to sense and listen for anything that is being noticed. So the people who work directly with customers, who are on the front line, who are in the call centers, right? They're such a wealth of information because they have their finger literally on the pulse of what humans are asking and talking about. So it's a good example of sensing, which is a little different than going off and running a very particular study in a very particular place at this moment in time, which is also valuable for things. But you get what I'm saying. It's getting good at sensing in real time. And sensing in real time doesn't have to mean quantitative data. It can mean very qualitative, very human narrative inquiry, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other piece of that is respond. Are you good at responding? When you realize something is changing, how quickly can you change in response? If it takes 9 months of planning and strategic road mapping to even be able to make a little pivot, y'all are in trouble. So that is what I meant by that phrase. We don't need to be as tightly linked to a confidence in our answers, because I guarantee at some point answers you think are right are going to later be wrong. It's how quickly and confidently do you feel you can respond when that happens. And so back to the uncertainty tolerance thing, I have kind of started to think that uncertainty tolerance is actually just a function of somebody's confidence in their own learning.
Mm,
And then not to get a little too like, but where does that come from? Right? I feel like a person who's always loved learning. So I can think to myself, I'm confident that I can figure almost anything out. Not like how to engineer a car, but I just mean if I'm faced with a weird scenario that's
mm,
very uncomfortable, I could be terrified, but I know with my support network, we can figure it out. I think a lot of that starts as early as childhood. Do you get to engage in risky play? Are you encouraged to take chances, et cetera, et cetera? And if the answer to all those things are no, it doesn't mean your life is, laid out for you and you'll never have it. It just means, how do you get it back? How do you reconnect yourself to your ability to sense and respond, to be quick at learning, to like learning? And a lot of that comes back to what I alluded to, right? That ability to
mm,
play and find environments where uncertainty is not scary, and get better at taking chances and having some of those things fail. And that's a whole
yeah.
nother podcast topic,
Yeah.
but yeah.
It reminds me, and I'm not sure who the quote is from, but um, sort of enjoying or falling in love with not knowing.
Mm,
If you sort of can, and this isn't black and white, but if you can build that capacity, I
yeah.
don't know, awesome.
Yeah.
Right? If that is your intrinsic response to uncertainty, I think you're pretty well on your way. But as you said, we might have a challenge with our educational system. We might have a
Yeah.
challenge with the reward systems within organizations
Yeah.
that aren't encouraging that response, right?
All true. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. But I will also say, because again, I can always hear the chorus of voices that are like, yeah, Jen, this is all great, but like, come work at my company for a day and you'll be like, I don't have patience for this. As designers, the notion of prefiguring, the notion of having an idea of a more desirable future and living a piece of it now, not just like be the change you want to see in the world, but actually finding ways to start to live or design or create versions of desirable futures in the current. And I think when I am faced with, probably I would call it a level of despair about how broken so many of our systems are, that don't encourage people to be comfortable with uncertainty and to have all their natural wiring for this learning intact. I do think it's part of how we are operate as living beings. It's innate in that way. It's the one thing I'd say is innate, is our instinct to learn. But I think for a lot of us, the metaphor I always use is like the hose is kinked and it's not severed permanently, but like unkink the hose, right? And so how do we help people do that? Well, to me, it's not cause for total, like, a fatalist kind of there's no hope. Yes, we can acknowledge bigger things need to shift, but if all you can control is your small little bubble, you can still start to design in a prefigurative way those opportunities for you or for your team, or again, whoever you're thinking about as an organization, to start to rebuild the capacity to be comfortable with not knowing, but then also to get better and more quick at sensing and better and more quick at responding. And even if that's limited by a larger part of the organization that kind of is a boundary hit when you do it, that's fine. Within your small local part, it's still going to make a difference. That I have seen. And that's the part where I say, people are like, this is all great, Jen, but like, how am I supposed to do it? Like when a client hires me, when I go into an organization and work with them, it's very rarely to change an entire enterprise organization. I mean, there've been some things that are kind of like that, but it's usually on a smaller team basis. And it's kind of showing that team, you guys already have everything you need to kind of push outwards, right? Instead of waiting from a top down to become a more adaptive organization or as a community for humans to get better at this, you can kind of from the inside almost like expand outwards by just doing things a tiny bit differently within what you're allowed to do. And I think that sort of prefigurative, like we can live and work and try to reclaim risky play and low stakes experimentation and loving not knowing in a way that actually builds adaptive capacity in a tiny little nugget of an organization, and the impact of that can actually be pretty big. Now for me to draw the impact of that to a bottom line, to another bottom line, to a bottom line that gets reported on the quarterly earnings report takes a bit of
Mm.
effort, but like you can usually show some intermediate impact that starts to ripple. And that's literally what people are usually looking for. It's
Mm.
doable.
And adding to that, like tying it back to the bottom line, um, if nothing else, your work becomes more interesting. Um, there is more curiosity. Like there is more space to actually be your full self in that environment. Well,
Yeah.
if we can tie it back to the bottom line, yeah, it still sounds like a pretty good equation.
Yeah. I mean, I also will say very briefly, take some risks, man. Life's too short. I always know there are people who listen to things I have to say and they write me later and they go, I love everything you have to say. I just can't convince anybody else on my team to see it this way. Or, in my organization, nobody cares about this stuff. And so I kind of just have to mask all day long, for lack of a better way to say it, and just put my head down and do it. And I have two answers to that. One is, who cares, man? Take some risks anyway. Like, life's too short. Or if you literally feel like that is not possible, then it becomes almost a function of like harm reduction is what I would say. At that point, it's you're on that desert island. You got to get away from the bear before you can start. And yes, there's a bear, then you can worry about learning after you've gotten out of direct existential threat. And I recognize that right now in particular, lots of people really are operating in kind of a metaphorical, existentially threatened place. So it feels sometimes like an indulgence to even think about learning. Are you kidding? I'm just trying to survive over here so I can close my laptop at 5 o'clock and hang out with my kids. And I'm like, I get it. But having adaptive capacity and having this kind of like just thinking about learning in the back of your mind can do a lot, even if you're not actively doing anything with it in the 9 to 5.
Bringing more play into our day to day would be good, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, Jen. Cool. If there's one thing people take away from our conversation, what do you hope it is? You've mentioned so many things, so many good things.
This whole conversation is kind of reminding me about something I've been joking with my friend about, that there was this phrase that was used a lot, at least over here in the States for a while. I don't remember where it came from, but it was like, but did you die? Like it was a thing people would say to each other, for a while, and then they'd be telling a story and someone, well, but did you die? And I kind of feel like we kind of need that a little bit in our work, which is like, you might be afraid, or you might not feel like you have the charter or the support to do something. And when I say do something, it could be everything we've been talking about, finding small places where you can open up some space for learning, for adaptation, to build that adaptive capacity. Just making something slightly less rigidly engineered, which I know goes against everything we say as designers. All of that can feel scary, or even introducing more play into what you do. But like at the end of the day, like if you do the thing, are you going to die?
Mm,
Like that,
mm-hmm,
I know this sounds absurd, but I kind of want to introduce like a level of like, just do it anyway. Just do it anyway. You're probably I can't guarantee it, but you're probably not going to die.
I would encourage people to take small bets initially,
Yes.
just to be on the safe side.
The other thing I'll say is you can actually be you can be subversive in very, very subtle ways. And I say subversive in a loving, creative way, creative destruction. Like if there's a piece of the system that I know would benefit from being a little bit looser, I'm not going to blow this whole thing up, but there are ways to introduce that little bit of uncertainty or that wiggle room or the openness in a team process that instead of this, then this, let's let it happen this way because something awesome might happen if we learn about a thing and then it changes. I mean subversive as in undermine instead of actively blow up, undermine carefully, to allow some of that. Like when you go to repot a plant, and the soil's all packed really tight and you kind of take it out and you loosen up the soil a little bit and air can get in there and water can better make its way to the roots. So you can think about your role sometimes not as actively driving and doing and taking risks and doing crazy things. And Jen's over here telling me to do stuff that's going to make me lose my job and I got to feed my kids. Nah, man, where in your job could you do the equivalent of loosening up the soil just a little bit? And that is where I think you reconnect the capacity for learning. And
Mm,
so I guess maybe that's the takeaway. If it's ask yourself, if I do this, but did you die? No, you're not going to die. But if that feels a little bit too crazy, then just loosen the soil up somewhere in your work.
yeah, we tend to end with a question here on the show that you'd like us to think about in the shower, but this one sounds already pretty good. Like, where can you loosen up the soil? And I like that analogy because sometimes often you do feel constrained, and it's time to, if you want to create space to grow, like, yeah, loosening up the soil is actually a good thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So is that your question for us? Where can
I
we
think
or
so.
should we?
Yeah, where could and where might you be able to loosen up the soil? And maybe it's a one person job that you can do. Maybe it's something you could enlist some friends in. Where?
Hmm.
I would actually love to hear
Well,
answers from folks. So put
that's a
them in the
nice pivot,
comments.
Jen. Thank you. If people want to send you love letters or hate mail, where should they go?
Send both to me on LinkedIn. You can find me. My email is jen@topologyinsight.com, and we can put that somewhere. I'm happy to receive email too. I love when people want to chat, want to have a conversation about this stuff. But LinkedIn's super easy to find me on. So find me on LinkedIn and then we can chat more. I want to hear all
Awesome.
about it.
Yes. Cool. Jen, thank you for taking us on this adventure. I think we've got a few puzzle pieces. Not sure if we have everything yet, but the issue is that we don't know what the full puzzle looks like. So
Yeah.
we'll keep on, we'll keep on searching. Thanks for coming on, sharing your honest and raw opinions. That's how we like it here on the show.
My pleasure. This was super fun.
Awesome. Thanks. As we wrap up, I hope you're feeling like I am, that maybe we have a bit more power to nudge things along in these complex systems than we often think. What really stood out to me was Jen's idea of loosening the soil. Those small, almost subversive acts we can take to create a little more space for learning and adaptation, even if the broader organization seems resistant. It's a strong reminder that we don't always need to have grand strategies. Sometimes just being a thoughtful wedge or creating those doorknob moments can make a real difference. A huge thanks to you, Jen, for sharing your wisdom and encouraging us all to perhaps take a few more small, playful risks. I hope this leaves you feeling a bit more optimistic about the ripples we can create. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, you can do me one big favor. Click the like button on this video and leave a short comment if you haven't done so already. Not to feed the algorithms, but to let me know whether or not we are on the right track by addressing topics like this. Finally, before we part ways, please take a moment to reflect and celebrate that by joining us today, you have directed your attention towards learning and growing as a professional. So, from everyone who you are going to impact through your work, thank you for taking the time and making the commitment. My name is Mark Fontijn, and I look forward to having you with us again for a new conversation on the Service Design Show. Take care and see you soon.